Michael, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Sorry, I think my microphone wasn't working, but I was just welcoming everyone. And Michael, you're welcome to introduce yourself. You may turn on your camera and you can just give a brief introduction to yourself.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Edelston. I'm a clinical toxicologist based in Edinburgh who spent quite a few years working with patients who are poisoned with pesticides in any form. Hi.
Thank you very much, Michael. And then we'll hand over to Alex. Alex, you may introduce yourself. And once you're done, you may proceed to the introduction for this discussion.
Hi everyone, hi Tatum. I can't turn on my video, it seems to be stopped by the host, but I can introduce myself. So I'm Alex Stewart, an agroecologist from Pesticide Action Network UK. I'm an international project manager for agroecology, and I'm involved in a number of projects involved in working on various topics such as supporting farmers to replace pesticides with agroecological approaches, and also investigating the negative effects of pesticides on human health and the environment. I've been working for PAN for a couple of years, and before that I worked for the International Rice Research Institute based in the Philippines and Indonesia, working on integrated crop pest management. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think your camera should work now, so you're welcome to switch it on. And I'm not sure if my microphone wasn't working in the beginning, but I just gave the brief rules for the discussion. So just everyone to introduce themselves in the chat room by giving us your name, your organization, your job title, and the country you work in. We would just like to ask all to respect each other's views, as this is a nonpartisan discussion, and we look forward to discussing this important topic today. So we'll now move on to the introduction, and Alex, you're welcome to take over. Thank you.
Thanks. So, so the main topic of our discussion today is paraquat. So paraquat is a broad spectrum herbicide, which is described as a burn down herbicide because it kills all the green plant material it is applied to. Is non-selective, but it's also highly toxic to humans, and thus it is frequently involved in fatal incidents due to suicides or accidental exposure. And there is also no antidote, and Michael will talk more about those harms in his introduction. Because of these harms, it's also banned in over 67 countries. There's still a number of countries where it's still widely used, and several of these occur in Asia and Latin America, for example. It is also very persistent in soils and sediments, and because of these harms, we are looking for ways to find alternatives to the use of paraquat. There is also a number of issues or concerns that paraquats can, by removing paraquat, can lead to reduction in crop productivity. So what we have done in this review, we've conducted a review of alternative methods to paraquat use and looked at how it's used, and also looked at successes in phasing it out by consulting with numerous regulators in countries that have banned paraquat, and also with supply chain actors. And in this process, we compiled this information in a publication that we have submitted to the Journal of Environmental Science and Pollution Research. And this is now at the final stage of the review process. In this discussion, we will present some of the main findings from this paper, as well as some of our other related research, and these will become topics for discussion, and we look forward to your views. So I think I'll pass over to Michael, or to give the next introduction to the next question, first question. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alex. Michael, you may proceed with question 1's introduction. Thank you.
Thank you. So what we're talking about today is paraquat. Here's the chemical structure on the left-hand side of my slide, and then some typical products. The classical one over the years is a 200 SL, so 20 grams per 100 mils, or 200 grams of the paraquat ion per liter. And this has been widely used since about 1967. In about 1970s, there were many reports of people accidentally or unintentionally drinking the pesticide. It had been put into Coke bottles, for example, for storage, and then people would drink it and die. So the kind of time the company producing the product added a blue coloring agent, a stenching agent, so the smell was obviously not Coke when you lifted the bottle towards your lips, and also an emetic agent, a chemical that made people sick. But the problem was the paraquat's very rapidly absorbed. And it looks like, in humans at least, in our recent work, this emetic doesn't seem to work at all. Anybody who vomits has absorbed enough, is probably going to die as a result. So, next slide, please. So this pesticide is quite corrosive as well as being damaging to plants. So people who've spilt it on their legs, such as the sprayer who sprayed a concentrated amount of paraquat on their legs and didn't wash it off quickly, has got quite marked damage. We know that people who drink the pesticide at moments of crisis and what's available to them or in an accident, they get marked mouth damage, as you can see this patient in the top left. And then you can see this mouth size, it's called paraquat tongue, because the paraquat really severely damages the mouth. Patients who typically take a smaller dose and don't die within the first few hours and days, go on to get a lung fibrosis. And what you can see in this picture is there's a pneumothorax. The lung has collapsed down on the left-hand side, and there's damage going down. There's damage on the right-hand side as well from the paraquat. So patients who survive the acute damage that occurs can actually go and die after a week or 2 weeks from lung damage. Next slide, please. This is some data from Sri Lanka, from predominantly 2 hospitals, but from a number of hospitals across the island. It was published in a paper early last year in 2021. And this compared all the different pesticides and their case fatality. So what you can see on the bottom is the percentage of people who die who come to hospital after drinking this pesticide. And then the 20%, 40%, or 60%. So every 100 people, 60 people would die if it was 60%. And there were 3 different periods. And what's quite clear in the early period, in 2002 to 2006, there's one pesticide that was particularly toxic. And that pesticide is paraquat. And here it is as the most toxic case fatality, around 50% or 55%. Over time, there were some reformulations produced, and there was a reduction over time. So by 2013 and 2019, the case fatality had come down to a relatively low 20% for paraquat. But if you look at all the other compounds, dimethoate, phenethione, quinophos, these are all organophosphorus insecticides, the case fatality didn't change very much over time and was always lower than paraquat. Looking at all these very common pesticides used in agriculture, you can see quite clear that paraquat is by far the most toxic one. And as you saw Dr. Jayakodi's comment there, he and his colleagues in Sri Lanka removed paraquat with really marked beneficial effects. Next slide, please. If we go to Japan, what we can see here is the use of paraquat and diquat in Japan from around 1965, 70 onwards. And you can see as it's introduced into agriculture, the amount of paraquat in green goes up until around about 1985. But then there's a sudden drop in use, and there's an increase in diquat. And the reason for that was previously people had been using paraquat 20 SL in their agriculture, but this had been associated with a huge increase in deaths. So we look at the number of deaths here. In the 70s, there was a very stable number. And then in the late 80s, the number started climbing markedly, so the early 80s. So by 1986, the Japanese government decided to get rid of the paraquat SL formulation and then only allow a much lower concentration paraquat diquat combination, which you can see in the top graph where the blue and the green meet. And actually, over time, they also was much more restricted about how paraquat and diquat could be used in Japan. So it was very much more difficult to buy. You couldn't go to shop and buy it yourself if you were not an agriculturalist. And you can see that the use of paraquat and diquat has just gone down and down and down over the years in Japan. As a result of that, the number of deaths from pesticide poisoning have also gone down from a peak of around 2,800 at the time that paraquat SL20 was withdrawn. And it was a rapid fall in those first few years, and then a gradual fall over time. And that's the green deaths here. Before 1995, there was no precise documentation of which non-organophosphate, which is why this is all gray. But then it became clear that most of these would have been green from the paraquat. So this shows really clearly that you can remove paraquat from your agricultural use, and you then get a good benefit in terms of people dying from pesticide poisoning. Next slide, please. And again, the key question, and this is the question that Alex is going to raise, is that clearly if you ban pesticides, you're going to have problems with agriculture. That's been the general idea for many years. So what we've looked in Japan is when they got rid of the paraquat SL20 and over years got rid of all forms of paraquat and diquat, it's now much less used. There's been no effect in multiple crops. These are all crops. So here we have pumpkins, rice, aubergine, etc., sweet potatoes, and then also fruits like oranges and peaches. They all had paraquat. They all used to use paraquat. But when we looked at these products in Japan, there's been no change at all in productivity. So it looks like, again, you can remove particular pesticides from agriculture without any effect. So what we found in Japan and other examples, reduced paraquat use results in reduced deaths from pesticide poisoning, and there was no effect on agricultural yield. This is a colleague of mine, Dr. Shushen Chang in Taiwan, who's working at the moment to remove paraquat there. And also, if you look in Korea, the slide's quite small, but if you see there was a paraquat ban in Korea. Thanks so much. On the left-hand side there, you can see that paraquat was banned in around 2011, 2012. And the blue line shows the number of suicides by pesticides. And it was around 18% before that ban, and now it's down to less than 8%. There's been a small reduction in the total number of suicides, which is the purple line, and a marked reduction in pesticide suicides. One of the reasons pesticide suicides are important is because they're often drunk at moments of crisis without much forethought. That people don't plan. They simply get stressed, they grab it, they drink it, and depending on what's available will determine their outcome. As shown in the Sri Lanka example on the right-hand side, if you just move the graph slightly to the right. Thank you. So Sri Lanka had a massive increase in numbers of suicides in the 1970s. And then it flattened out after parathion and methyl parathion were banned in 1983-84. And then in 1995, there was a systematic effect by the pesticide registrar, including Dr. Jayakodi, to start removing particular pesticides. It's not banning all pesticides, and this is very careful selection of the really highly hazardous pesticides. As a result of that, the suicide rate has fallen from around 50 per 100,000 down to about 17 per 100,000 now. And this data is from Dulika Knight. But paraquat was one of those ones which has really brought this continued line of falling down. So what we can show from the health effects is that paraquat is a completely lethal pesticide after ingestion at moments of crisis. There are some occupational problems with it. And if you remove it from agricultural use, we don't find any effects on agriculture, but we do see marked effects in health benefits. So I hand that back to you, Tatum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that introduction. So we'll now move on to discussing the question for 20 minutes in the chat room. So the question is, are you aware of health problems with paraquat? If yes, please give examples in the chat. You may list your country in your response and how recent the cases of health problems were. So we'll move over to the chat room. We will have some polls throughout this question that you are welcome to answer on the screen. But for now, you may provide your responses in the chat room. Thank you. While you're responding to your questions in the chat room, you will see that we have posted a poll. The poll reads, is paraquat used in your country? You can respond either no, or yes, it is registered for use, or yes, it is, but tightly restricted. Yes, but it is to be withdrawn or banned within the next few years. Or yes, it is banned, but there's illegal trade. To answer the poll, the link has been posted in the chat room. You may click on the link. Alternatively, you may go to www.menti.com and use the code on the screen.
Tatum, sorry to show my ignorance. Is there a chat discussion going on outside the Zoom chat box? Or is everything coming through that chat box?
It should be coming through the chat box. Everyone, you're welcome to post your responses.
So I can see a response from Karine. Thank you for that. But I can't see any more.
And to answer the poll, there's a link that has been posted in the chat room as well, so you can click on that to provide your responses. Do you have any comments, Michael, on Karine's comment?
I mean, the classical problems, people often putting it in a bottle, which people don't know is paraquat, and then people accidentally drink, which seems very unfortunate. So I presume paraquat is available in South Africa, but I'm not quite sure which of the yeses it is. Tightly restricted, to be withdrawn, for illegal trade. It seems that people aren't generally aware of any problems with paraquat. A bit of supposition. We know in Guyana and Suriname, there's a huge problem with paraquat. So in North South America, we know that it's now being used more in India, and it's becoming a problem in India. So there's cases of deaths occurring in the northeast of the country, in Odisha state. China has banned it finally in 2020, but still allows exports to other countries. Thank you, Sheila. It will be interesting to map out these results, to actually take a map of people represented here and show which regions are still using it.
We can do that for in the digest. We can just sort of arrange it accordingly to see where it is being used and in the countries in the region, just to get an idea of where it's mostly concentrated.
Yeah, renal failure is a marker of bad outcome in paraquat poisoning. People sometimes just have a bad mouth from taking it in the mouth and spitting it out. But if you start showing signs of your kidneys not working, that generally shows paraquat is having a very bad effect. Interesting, Rwanda and Uganda, it's banned. Okay.
Do you have any comments to make on the poll before we move on to the next one?
I think it's interesting that it's still available. It'd be nice to know which countries they were. So mapping this out would be very interesting. Also very interesting to know which countries is going to be withdrawn or banned in within the next few years. So I don't know if there's a way you can find out who answered this and get the answer to that, or if you have to ask people. But to identify those 3 countries would be really useful.
So I'm actually going to, in the next slide, before the poll, I'll post a world map with a pin location. So everyone who says that, are you looking, who says no, it hasn't been banned, or do you want people answered yes to see which countries is it from?
Okay. Perhaps is paraquat a problem in Nigeria? Are there cases of people dying from it? Diclorvos or sniper was the problem there for a long time. Okay.
So would you like participants to pin on the map which country it is banned in? Is that the question, Michael?
Just there's 3 countries where it's being potentially going to be banned. So Zambia sounds like Patricia's labeled Zambia as one of them, but there were 2 others. So I was interested to know what the other 2 countries
So you
were.
can just, the 3 participants who responded that you are welcome to just pin on the map which country it will be banned in. So let's see. So we're talking about the 3 participants that responded to this poll. So if those 3 participants can please pin on the map the country. So I see we got a pin for, is this just of Australia? You can welcome to type it in the chat room as well. So we have 1 pin location over there, Michael.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see the comments about Laos. Also Malawi, the banning of it. It's really important to have the whole region banning it, which makes crossing borders more difficult, but not impossible. Should we go on to the next question?
Sure. So the next poll is, who is most at risk of paraquat poisoning in your country? So participants, you may select 3 of the options. And we have 5 more minutes to respond to the question in the chat room as well, before moving on to question 2. I'm not sure if you have any comments on, I see Brian posted in South Africa to use in agriculture as a combination under generic names. So do you have any comment on that, Michael?
I think the people at risk are a number of different people. So many of these communities are at risk. I mean, I think the main concern with paraquat is actually more intentional overdoses rather than occupational exposure. Clearly, it is a hazardous pesticide, and people getting soaked to the skin and not washing off can result in consequences of that. The argument for pulmonary fibrosis resulting from inhalation is not clear. There was a study in California which didn't find any evidence for that. But I think there clearly are hazards from using it. But to be honest, the key concern is people self-harming with paraquat. So actually people in the communities where pesticides are used. So there may actually be children, teenagers in rural families, but not just children. Many adults I've seen die from paraquat poisoning. So actually, to me, the answer would be people living in rural communities as a more general comment, which would include farm workers and plantation workers and people who just live in the community and don't directly use pesticides.
So if we look at the poll, would that mean that sort of we see that there's definitely between the people who've responded concentrated groups that they've chosen and sort of left children, teenagers in rural families and women in rural families empty. So would you say, Michael, that that should also have been part of the top 3 options selected?
I think it's a very generic group. I mean, I think there's not just workers. So the top line is basically people working, which clearly has some level of exposure to paraquat. But the people who are dying are not people working with the product. Normally, they're people who have it stored unsafely in their communities because it's not possible to store it safely. And at moments of stress, drinking it. And that's where most of the deaths occur. And it's probably 100,000 people have died from paraquat. Well over 100,000 since it's been introduced. So it's a fairly major problem.
I know someone mentioned earlier about poisoning centers, and so I guess, yeah, it would be linked into the underreporting of as you said, there's so many cases, but not probably as reported as much as it should be.
For sure. I mean,
So
it's sometimes not recognized, but if it's self-harm, it often is recognized. People are familiar, clinicians are familiar with it. They should recognize it.
Thanks, Michael. So we already reaching the end of this question. So do you have any concluding thoughts or comments that you'd like to make before we move on to question 2? Can we move on to question 2, Michael? Or do you have any last comments to make?
No, not at all. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So we'll hand over to Alex. Alex, you're welcome to take us through question 2. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, very interesting so far. So, yeah, so as was mentioned earlier and by Michael, there are concerns about the effect of a ban on agricultural productivity, and this can often be one of the main stumbling blocks to banning paraquat in those countries where it's still available. So as part of this review study, we decided to look at FAO stat data, to look at productivity data in a number of countries from different regions where paraquat bans had been implemented at least 6 years ago, so we could analyze the data before and after the ban. So similar to what Michael presented on Japan and Taiwan, but this data we looked at is for a wider spread of countries. So So this slide basically shows the productivity data for those selected countries that we looked at. So on the left-hand slide or left-hand graph, we see the data from 6 West African countries that banned paraquat in 2011. And on the right-hand side, we see the productivity data for 5 other countries. So you can see the names of those countries there. Sorry, I should say, please move on to the next slide, Tatum. Yeah, so on the left side there, we see the 6 West African countries that banned paraquat in 2011. And on the right slide, we see the 5 other countries that banned paraquat at least 6 years ago. So those include France, South Korea, UK, Sri Lanka, and Mozambique. And the graphs showed the yield, the annual yield on average for all crops grown in those countries, 6 or 7 years before the ban and 6 or 7 years after the ban. So the ban is the year of the ban is indicated by the dotted line. And what we see is that there is no observable decline in yields in each of those countries following the ban. And in fact, in some of the countries, we see an increase in yield, for example, in Senegal and Mauritania. We also had a look at some key crops grown for each of those countries that were grown using paraquat. And similarly, we saw no observable decline in yield. And so this indicates that there are alternative methods for weed management available for different crops and different regions. And I'll discuss some of those on the next slide. So if you could go to the next slide. So here, what we did next was to look at the literature review on what are the alternative methods for weed management and for removing crop foliage as opposed to paraquat. And our review yielded that there are a wide range of alternative methods indeed for both of these management practices. And these generally include alternative herbicides, living mulches and cover crops, especially for like interrows, biocontrol agents, for example, using decomposer microbes to break down post-harvest foliage in pineapple plantations, controlled grazing, for example, in oil palm plantations or vineyards, mechanical weeding. This can either be a manual push type weeder or it can be a tractor pulled weeder. And there is a growing technology in thermal weeding. So this can include basic flamethrowers, but now there's increasing studies or science looking at electrothermal weeding as well. We also, through our review and consultation, found that there are a number of private voluntary standards that are have either banned paraquat from their supply chains or are phasing them out, as well as several European retailers, which indicate that paraquat can be successfully phased out across a number of crops and in different regions. And from following consultations, they indicated that there were no major reductions in agricultural yield or increases in costs following those bans. And if you would like to look for further information in our paper, we provide case studies on coffee, tea, potatoes, and pineapples. And next slide, please. But one thing we would mainly like to highlight is that we need to express caution when selecting substitute herbicides when replacing paraquat. For example, some such as diquat can simply replace one hazard with another hazard. However, there's also consensus building among weed scientists that we need to move away from current levels of herbicide reliance and rethink approaches to managing weeds or living with a level of weeds and better understanding their benefits. For example, many plants considered to be weeds may provide important habitat, food for pollinators and other beneficial insects. They provide an important food source for rural communities or help to suppress problematic weeds. If we allow beneficial weeds to persist, they can suppress the problematic weeds that the farmers are mainly concerned about, or they can also provide valuable ground cover and protect the soil and soil microorganisms from sun and rain damage as well as erosion. So instead of aiming for weed eradication, we should be aiming to reduce the negative impact of weeds while retaining some of the ecological benefits and their ecosystem services. And it's thus important that an integrated weed management approach is promoted. And this involves diversifying weed management strategies and reducing the reliance on herbicides by integrating a variety of physical, cultural, and ecological methods. Next slide, please. So, do I pass back to you, Tatum?
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for that presentation. There's been a big appetite for alternatives in just our previous discussions. I think just some examples of those that are available is really good to see. So I think that leads us into question 2, which we have 20 minutes to discuss, and we would like to ask the participants whether you know of any examples of successful alternative approaches to paraquat use for either weed management or crop desiccation. If so, please provide examples in the chat room, and please list your country in your responses. We will have polls and we'll launch them throughout the question while you're discussing it. Thank you, everyone.
So as you're responding, one thing I didn't really explain well in the introduction is that paraquat is widely used for crop desiccation as well as for weed management. So this involves applying paraquat within a few weeks of harvest to either help remove crop foliage, for example, for potatoes, or to help the seeds mature faster, for example, in soybean. And it's also used to remove the crop foliage after harvest, for example, in pineapples, so that to help remove the waste foliage before preparing the land for the next crop. But this raises serious concerns when applied within a few weeks of harvest due to the potential for residues in the crop, especially if it's a food crop at harvest.
I see someone has asked us to share the presentation, and we will definitely do that together with the digest. If you would like to receive that, we would encourage you to sign up to the discussion forum. We will send the link to that in the chat room as well. So while we wait for responses, you'll see that there is a poll on the screen. You may answer the poll by clicking on the link that will be posted in the chat room or going to menti.com and putting in the code. The question is asking what crops are paraquat mainly used for in your country, and you may select up to 3 options.
Okay, I see, yeah, there's an answer from Ahmad saying in Iran, there are several herbicides being used to replace paraquat, diuron and 2,4-D and MCPA. Same in Malawi, but glyphosate is mentioned. Gift has mentioned that the small agricultural machines such as row weeders are being used to reduce paraquat use in Nigeria, so that's great. That's nice to see non-herbicide examples. And good to see it's also less labor intensive. Thank you. Right. good to see that UCT has moved towards mechanical control on campuses as well. And Lovemore also mentioned mechanical weed control is being used for intercrops and as well as integrated weed management. Lovemore, where are you from? If you could indicate in the chat, that would be great to know. Thanks. So I'm looking at the poll now. So yeah, Karina's mentioned sugarcane. Lovemore says Zimbabwe. Thank you. So sugarcane is a crop that's not mentioned on the poll, so that's one to add. So the other crops that are coming out, quite a few here. So we've got maize, soybean, rice, orchard, banana, and potato coming out quite frequently. Yes, potato was a use where paraquat was widely used as a sort of a harvest aid in Europe until it was banned. This was simply to remove the foliage to improve the harvest process. I'm not sure, yeah, which countries it's still being used for potato, but I assume it's for the same purpose. Again, there are alternative methods, both mechanical and other herbicides that can be used to replace paraquat there. Rice, as it is non-selective, it would burn the rice crop if it's used within the field. So it's usually used to clear the fields of weeds or clear the field edges. And maize, very commonly used. It can be used also to clear land for maize, from my understanding. Again, for many of these crops, there are alternatives available. The chat.
Before I move on to the second poll, do you have any comments on this poll? I know you've provided some feedback. We'll quickly move on.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting to see some of the others coming up, other crops in the chat there, cassava, vegetables, as well as the crops listed in the poll here. Yeah, it's good to note that the main uses seem to be banana, rice, maize, and orchard crops. So banana and orchard crops, yeah, are more perennial, so they would involve more of a sort of need for cover cropping or livestock introduction, can be very successful in those systems. And rice and maize is more to do with clearing land before planting, where there is a need to bring in other methods of weed removal. Could be less toxic herbicides or use of mechanical methods, or even livestock in some certain conditions where livestock are available. Okay, thanks. Yeah, you could go to the next poll.
So we'll post the link in the chat room, and the next poll is an open-ended question. And so we're asking you, are there specific uses in which you think it is difficult to remove paraquat from use? And if so, if you can list those uses. You may as well put your country in your response.
I see a message from Bruce saying paraquat was never promoted as a harvest aid in potato in Europe. Replanting and post-planting only. I'm assuming you don't mean it wasn't used as a harvest aid. Andrea mentioned there's broader use of paraquat than just crops. Some invasive alien species and fire breaks. And also the urban weed control, as you mentioned before, on the campus. So Bruce says it was not used as a harvest aid in potato in Europe. Okay. So my understanding is it was used, at least in UK, as a harvest aid until it was banned. Then it was replaced with diquat, and then diquat was banned. So I'm curious, yeah, to which countries you're referring to. So in response to the poll, here we've got a response from Bruce. So diquat was used as a harvest aid in potatoes supported by a stewardship program. Okay. Is that in UK, Bruce, are you referring to there? Or in Europe in general? So I think Andrea's got a question for the group, perhaps. What is the main reason for promoting the continued use of paraquat? Is it price, profit, or food security? There's a number of reasons that we hear, but be interested to hear what the others think. Costa Rica paraquat uses in pineapples used to desiccate the plant after harvest. That's right. If not, then a lot of flies appear. And that's where, yeah, a lot of research has been done to develop or promote decomposer microbes to improve that process. And now there's some successful methods with that have successfully replaced paraquat. And we give some examples in that review paper that was shared, where we consulted a few retailers and a pineapple producer. Okay, so back to the poll. So response to the question, are there specific uses in which you think it's difficult to remove paraquat? So we have several saying no, it's not difficult. One is because paraquat is a quick acting herbicide. In Guyana, it's useful for root cash and vegetable crops during short windows. Response saying it is successfully replaced by glyphosate in rice and tea, or by glufosinate ammonium, or alternatives can be expensive, as is the case in Tanzania.
Indira has a hand up, so you're welcome to post your response in the chat room. The chat room is at the bottom of the screen. You'll see a speech bubble and you can click on that and post your response.
So there was a response to Andrea's questions. Gift was saying in Nigeria it's thought to be more effective. More effective when applied compared to other herbicides. And she elaborated to say that's the belief among farmers and pesticide marketers. So one thing I didn't explain is, or introduce, and as something we cover in our review, is the issue of resistance. And it'd be great to get thoughts on those in the chat of experiences of paraquat resistance in their country, because there is an increasing level of resistance to paraquat among a number of weed species. And that would also be interesting to hear about. So I see in the chat, the rolling chat, in the rolling poll, one of the uses where it's difficult, it is mentioned it was difficult to remove paraquat for rice and tea before the ban. It'd be great if you could elaborate in the chat which country that's from, and has it now been successfully replaced after the ban in those two crops?
Before we move on to question 3, Alex, do you have any overall comments to make on this question? Anything that stood out to you?
I think it's reassuring to see that there aren't too many challenges with where paraquat can be removed, but some of the challenges are related to cost. Paraquat is very cheap, and the alternatives maybe not always available or well known. The training hasn't been conducted on integrated weed management, for example, and the effectiveness in certain situations, like short windows, and that may be because, yeah, again, there's limited knowledge on alternatives. So I think this is where we can talk about the next part of the question, or the next question, I'd say, on how we address those challenges.
Thanks, Alex. You're welcome to take us into question 3's background.
Okay, so in the latter part of our review for this paper, we consulted through interviews and questionnaires 7 current or former pesticide regulators from countries that had banned paraquat across a number of regions, such as in Europe, South America, Asia, and the Pacific. And as part of this consultation process, we provided a number of belief statements and asked the regulators to rank, based on their opinion, whether they agreed or how much they agreed on the belief statements. And the results of those questions are presented on this slide, which showed that all agreed, to their knowledge, banning paraquat had no adverse effect on crop yields in the country of the ban. 4 out of 7 considered that banning paraquat had no adverse effect on farmer incomes, and 3 were unsure due to lack of knowledge, so lack of data collected on the topic. And then 5 agreed that banning paraquat had greatly reduced incidences of human pesticide poisonings, and 2 were unsure due to the short interval since the ban. And so there was lack of data on that. Next slide, please. We also asked for their opinions on challenges faced during or after a paraquat ban, and also on some of the successes of the bans in the country. So the challenges here included management of illegal smuggling of paraquat from neighboring countries where paraquat is still legally sold or produced. For example, we hear about the illegal use of paraquat in Laos in the chat. Paraquat has been banned in Laos since 2013, but it is still illegally smuggled into the country. This is largely coming from China and Vietnam, but 2 years ago in 2020, Vietnam banned the use and the production of paraquat. So we hope to see a reduction in imports from Vietnam, but it may still be coming from China, where it is still produced. Another challenge is that inadequate bans allow registration of paraquat via alternative formulations. This actually happened in China, where the liquid formulation was banned, and a gel formulation was allowed to be registered. The gel formulation was considered to be safer, but it did not significantly reduce the number of suicides from paraquat use. So since then, the gel formulation has also been banned. Limited stocks of alternative herbicides are a problem. So where the alternatives that are promoted to farmers are a herbicide, but that herbicide is in short supply, the farmers have little knowledge on what else they can use. So that's an issue that needs to be planned for a ban. And the insufficient time to evaluate alternative methods before a ban was implemented due to a lack of a transition period. So this is where a ban was suddenly enforced, and there was no time to prepare for the ban. And finally, there's a difficulty in convincing farmers because they do not view health and safety as a priority concern over yield or income, for example. Okay, next slide, please. So we were given a number of success factors by the respondents, and there were three general successes that came about. And one was that it's important to establish an independent and multi-stakeholder advisory panel or committee early on in the process. The second is it's important to engage with different public and private sector organizations, including customs departments, and also to plan and coordinate actions amongst different organizations and departments, government departments. And also, it was very important to have awareness programs and share information either through the media or through farmer training about paraquat hazards, plan bans, the times of the restriction periods and transition periods, and also on the alternatives that can be used to replace paraquat. This latter point is especially important to increase public support using scientific evidence-based information, and also to help farmers to understand the health protection rationale for the ban, so they understand why it's banned, and for both their health and for others in the community. So I think that's the end of my background. So back to you, Tatum.
Thank you very much, Alex. So we will discuss question 3 for the remainder of the session. So question 3 reads, what recommendations do you have for overcoming barriers to banning paraquat? You may provide your country in your response, and we will also have a few poll questions that will be posted throughout the question.
So maybe, Tatum, if you go to the first poll, that may help lead this question a bit, I think.
So as you can see on the screen, the poll question asks, what are the main barriers to banning paraquat in your country? You may select up to 3 options. The link to responding to this poll has been posted in the chat room. Alternatively, you can go to www.menti.com and provide the code and you'll be able to respond.
Okay, so a response to question 3 from Ahmad in Iran, suggesting that more awareness, strictly stopping production companies from paraquat production is needed. And especially, I think you mean from those countries that are exporting as well. Yeah, see in the poll there's quite a lot responding saying there's a lack of national data on alternative methods. I'm sort of curious here to explore whether that's because it's the way the answer is set up. I mentioned we put there lack of national data, and I wonder when regulating pesticides, is it important to have national data, or can you also use data from other countries, especially within the same region or same agro-ecosystem profile? So, lack of national data on paraquat harms. Maybe Michael may want to comment on that one. That's also frequently coming up. And again, these options that are coming up frequently, it'd be great to get your thoughts on what can be done to overcome those barriers that are coming up in the chat, especially for your country. And again, we're getting quite a few responses for the other options. So limited availability of alternatives, difficulty to convince farmers, expectations that alternatives are too expensive. So an answer from Gift here is saying trainings and peer discussions about the health effects of paraquat among agricultural workers has been helpful in overcoming barriers. That's very useful. Thank you. Andrea is saying that the health risk information is usually only available to regulators and not to the users or consumers. More effort is needed to demonstrate the effectiveness of alternatives, especially if they're readily available in the market. Kasozi is saying global campaigns using FAO should be conducted globally to combat paraquat use. So Sumit is saying glyphosate is becoming indispensable. I'm not sure what you mean by POEA-free formulations, but are you saying it's becoming indispensable because of a paraquat ban and now farmers are reliant on glyphosate?
Alex, before we move to the next poll, do you perhaps have any last comments on this poll to make?
No, just seeing now that the expectations that alternatives are too expensive has shot up in responses, which is certainly an issue I've heard. And yes, it's an issue that is difficult to address directly because of the limited information on limited economic data comparing alternatives with paraquat use. This is something where the more data is certainly welcome. And then, yeah, the issue here with difficulty in convincing farmers, and that's where more awareness and training might be needed. Michael, would you like to say anything on the lack of national data on paraquat harms, which was raised quite frequently?
I mean, I think there's a general lack of data on harms from pesticides at a national level. Clearly, the harms in one country are going to be very similar to other countries, depending on the structure of society and of the rural communities working in agriculture. So I think there's enough information out there on harms from paraquat, which is probably less important to have it on national level because it's really not available on a national level for many pesticides.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that with regards to the alternative methods as well. Something else I was trying to explore. So, okay, that's great. Should we move to the next poll?
Sure. So the next poll has been posted. It is asking participants, what methods do you think could work best to tackle illegal transboundary movements of paraquat? Select 3 options. So the link will be posted in the chat room, and you're welcome to either then go to www.menti.com and put in the code.
Yeah, so this poll was related to one of the challenges that was raised by some of the regulators we consulted during the paper consultation process, and it's obviously an important topic, not just for paraquat but for other pesticides as well. And if you have experience where you've been able to successfully address this, or where you have thoughts on how it can be best addressed, we'd like to hear from you. Sumit has replied, so POE is the surfactant supplied with glyphosate. Okay, yeah. And what country, or Sumit, in your response earlier when you said farmers are becoming dependent on glyphosate, is that where paraquat has been banned? And can you mention the country as well that this is happening? Maybe the crop too, if you have that information. Missed some of the chat going up to it. So see, Lovemore has said that safer, effective and cheaper alternatives should be available. Farmer-friendly policies should be put in place, and heavy penalties on illegal traders and dealers. All very good suggestions.
I see that Andrea made a comment saying that it is difficult to convince. Is it equally difficult to convince farmers at from large scale commercial farms versus small scale farms? I'm not sure if you have a comment on that, Alex. So if Andrea, if you want to perhaps ask that question.
Yeah, I think that is a good question. I think, yeah, the very different dynamics and approach the farming business differently. So, yeah, would be an interesting question to pose to others. Okay, keep the poll here. We have one other that's been listed, which is support farmers to implement alternative practices, especially integrated pest management, so that paraquat becomes redundant. Okay, so yeah, just going back to the root of the problem, not in how to turn off the tap, but not, sorry, what was I going to say? Not about how to, yeah, stop the dripping, but actually turn off the tap. So the main responses on addressing illegal movement of transboundary movement of paraquat seem to be publishing and distributing lists of banned and registered products, training enforcement agencies, and establishing regional bans. So equal numbers so far in those three. Establishing fines is also has received a lot of responses, and also encouraging paraquat producing countries to implement export bans.
I see that Lovemore has commented on the large scale versus small scale farmers, and I think I'm not sure if you're aware of that paper, Alex, as well on misuse, where the argument sort of is that irrespective of whether the pesticide or this hazardous pesticide or paraquat is used correctly or not correctly, the problem is still with the toxicity of it. So sort of saying that it's still not justified for large scale commercial farmers to be using it, because we can't assume that one is going to work and not for the other. So in terms of this misuse that's been alluded to.
Yes, yeah. I haven't seen the paper, but yeah, that sounds interesting.
I'll share the link in the chat room.
Just look at the comment in the chat from Keith about alternatives for breaking down the crop foliage and pineapple plantations in Costa Rica. So yeah, we have documented a case study from several inputs on that subject in this review paper that's been shared. So yeah, please take a look at that. So there's a comment here from Bruce about closed transfer systems, which can certainly help to reduce the hazards during application. But I guess there's still the hazard of having the product available in farm and the home if it is there is this risk of an attempt of suicide or self-harm.
So we have 5 more minutes left for the session. Alex and Michael, you're welcome to both turn on your cameras and provide any last concluding thoughts or comments that you have for the 3 questions that were discussed.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the poll now and seeing that, yeah, there's a lot of favor for establishing regional bans to reduce illegal movement of paraquat across borders. But general agreement for all of those options that we've listed there.
And clearly having effective alternatives which are widely used will reduce the pull for transboundary movement. So fundamentally, it's about finding alternatives that work and people are happy with, because that will reduce smuggling and it will reduce the need to register these crops, these pesticides. And in reality, paraquat is simply too toxic a pesticide to be used in small-scale farming. Smaller, medium scale.
Yeah, the general impression I'm getting from the chat is there is a need for more information on alternatives to help, increase the confidence of the regulators making decisions, and also for the farmers who would need to switch away from paraquat if paraquat is to be banned. I think what we try to do in this paper that has been shared is try and compile a review of those alternatives to hopefully support regulators and policymakers, as well as technical advisors on farm and through training government agencies. And what we implore is more studies to be conducted on looking at the economic data, as that's where we fall slightly short. But from experience and consultation with regulators and other supply chain stakeholders, it appears that paraquat can be successfully replaced without losses in income as well as yield, as we've shown from the data.
Thank you very much, Alex. And then we just would like to thank the presenters for leading such an engaging discussion. I think it was a very useful discussion and topic, and the paper that was shared. And so we'll just share that again, the link in the chat room. And then we would just like to take this time to ask everyone to complete the evaluation form that would now appear on your screen, and to save the date for the next discussion. So the next discussion will be our last discussion for 2022, and it will be held on the 8th of December. And we'll be discussing drones and pesticides part 2, since we had the first session of this in the beginning of the year, and just given the huge interest shown, we'll be having it as our sort of concluding session for this year. So we encourage you to register for that discussion. And I would like to thank all the participants in the chat room for just sustaining this very vibrant discussion that we've been having, and then just recognize Andrea Rother, who is the head of the Environmental Health Division and the forum moderator. And thank you to Naomi, who is helping in the background as well. And thank you, everyone, and see you in the next discussion.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.